Hi, welcome to the Good Fight on Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads, and I'll be the heard but not seen moderator today for debate on the issues of religious liberty and gay rights and how they intersect. My guests today are Mark Joseph Stern, who is a writer for Slate, and Matthew Schmitz, who is deputy editor of First Things. So I thought we would start with what's become kind of the emblematic case of where religious beliefs and gay rights intersect, which is the wedding vendor who refuses to provide a service for a same-sex wedding. Uh, so, Mark, how would you respond to this classic case of the baker who refuses to make a cake for a same-sex wedding?
So I think the baker and the florist who refuse to serve a same-sex wedding are a little different from the photographer who refuses to serve a same-sex wedding, because with the photographer, you've got some true First Amendment free speech issues. Is photography speech? So leaving that aside, if we're just talking about the baker or the florist, to my mind, this is a pretty easy issue. I mean, these are refusal to serve cases. And these are states that have said, look, gay people are a protected class of citizens, and businesses, if you're going to open your doors to the public, then you have to open your doors to all of the public. And you don't get to selectively choose a certain class of people and refuse to serve them. I see it as a very simple issue. I think multitudes of previous legal precedent guide our way toward a simple solution here.
That kind of a curious distinction you're making. It seems to me that you're saying that photography is a real art, but baking, and arranging flowers aren't arts.
So
And
yes, I think that
there's something that's kind of troubling in that to me, which is that these are arts that are kind of they're like less prestigious forms of craft. Architecture, that might be considered an art, but when it comes to like being a florist, a profession in which a lot of businessmen are actually businesswomen. For you, that doesn't count as art. That doesn't merit free speech protection.
So I will say, for the sake of consistency, I come down the same place with the photography case. I think that even though there are some more significant First Amendment concerns with photography, I think that the same principle guides there, which is that if you are a photographer for money, a photographer for pay, you hire out your photography services to the public. You're not a private photographer, you are a photographer for the public. Then when you open your doors to perform that service for the public, you have to perform it for all of the public. So I don't want to draw those kinds of narrow distinctions between the high arts and the low arts and decide that, oh, well, baking is a low art, so it doesn't merit free speech protections, whereas photography is a high art, so it does. I don't want to draw those lines either. I see your point there. And so for the sake of consistency, I'll hold that all three of these examples, the baker, the florist, and the photographer, are really the same category of refusal to serve cases.
Right, but I think that you're still failing to recognize the way that these people, say, you have a wedding photographer out in the Sun Belt or a baker in the Midwest. Do you know any religious people, Mark? I mean, do you understand how their convictions inform, not just their activities on Sunday morning, but every aspect of their business?
Oh, yes, of course.
People
I grew
like
up in the
Hobby
Deep
Lobby.
South. So
Okay.
I grew up in the
So
Deep
you
South.
did.
I know many. Yes, and I went to Georgetown
Right.
University. So it was Jesuit Central.
Well, I wouldn't confuse that with being religious. Um, but these people have a kind of much less secularized view of their everyday activities than probably a lot of Blogging Heads listeners do. For them, when they go to photograph a wedding, they're not just doing a job; they're celebrating what they view as the sacrament of marriage, and lending their art, which they have a very high view of, to this celebration. And so it's a matter of grave conscience for them to be compelled by the state to do so. And I think that a lot of people simply fail to understand that because, most of us, we go to our job, it's 9 to 5. Does it implicate our deepest beliefs? Probably not. But for these people, it really does, and I think we need to, understand that.
Okay, so I have to ask the classic question here, right? If there is a Christian photographer who truly believes that interracial marriage is unholy and unsacred and a violation of God's will, as many religious people have for a long time, perhaps fewer today, many fewer, but it's well known that many did for a long time. Would you agree that that photographer could cite her religious principles, her sincerely held religious beliefs, and refuse to photograph that wedding too?
The photographer could do whatever she'd like. I think the state should compel her to do so. Not all claims are, need to be accorded equal respect. And this is where the real disagreement lies. I'm a Christian, Mark, and if you look at the Christian tradition, St. Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And even though, religious people have advocated for all sorts of things, just as, sensibly irreligious people have advocated for all sorts of things, we don't have to accord their claims equal weight. And this is where I think the Selma analogy that you put forward in all your pieces breaks down. It seems to me that you've built a journalistic kind of trail off of using two adjectives and combining them with the names of various politicians, bigoted and homophobic. And
there's another one, animus, although I guess that's an
animus.
Yeah.
You do use one word I like, argle-bargle.
Oh, it's a great one.
An affection for which you share with Antonin Scalia. Yes. But otherwise, it seems to me that your career has been kind of cheaply trading off the legacy of the civil rights and drawing really simple analogies between that and the gay rights situation today. And the problem with that is this. Forgive my editorial critiques of your writing, but the real problem with it, beyond your own pieces, is that you're setting up a conflict between gay rights and any kind of religious belief. As best I understand it, and maybe you could clarify, Mark, you say you know a lot of religious people, but in your writing, I detect the conviction that gay rights are necessarily and fundamentally opposed to any expression of the traditional moral witness in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, any classical religious tradition, that marriage is of necessity between one man and one woman.
Well, I wouldn't agree, because I think that personally, and I hope that I've conveyed this even a little bit in my writing, I think that there are different realms in American life. We have very much a public sphere, a public space, where we have decided that the state can impose burdens on our behavior and the state can regulate in a certain way, and there are private spheres. And so, for instance, I've written that a Catholic school is entirely within its rights to fire a teacher for being gay. I think that is unquestionable. It is undoubtedly within the rights of a private Catholic school to follow its own creed and say, we do not want a spiritual leader of ours to be openly homosexual to, whatever they want to say. I think that is absolutely correct. I think that is the right decision. I wrote, if I were the judge in that lawsuit in Washington State, I would throw the case out immediately because I don't think that that gay teacher even has legal grounds to stand on. Now, that is a private situation. That is a private Catholic school. And what we're talking about here, and what I often write about, are public spaces, public spheres. We're talking about a photographer who throws open her doors to the public and says, I am a photographer for anyone who comes to me and anyone who asks that I serve her. A florist who says, I am in the phone book, you can Google me, come to me, public. She is a business, she's running a business, and in doing so, she's sort of subjecting herself to the state's regulations. And I think that, to me, it seems fairly clear that the notion that the state can tell private businesses who they can't, who they're not permitted to refuse service to, is a settled principle in law, it seems to me. Perhaps you disagree. But if it is a settled principle that...
I don't disagree at all, but what I do disagree with is your suggestion that to believe marriage is between a man and a woman is the same thing as believing that a black man is not equal to a white man or a black woman is not equal to, any other person. Your analogy between the history of racism and slavery in this country and the Christian moral witness, which is one of the things that helped, animate the civil rights movement. That's what I object to.
So. How would you respond?
Not the idea that we can't force public accommodation, but but the suggestion that when Mother Teresa, for example, says that marriage is between a man and a woman, as she did, that she's expressing a sentiment that you would call bigoted and homophobic, a sentiment shared by any Catholic saint, by lots of Black Pentecostal ministers, lots of little nuns out in Kansas.
Now,
Mark, believe that all those people are bigots and homophobes.
I should say
you think you're a firefighter going out, battling intolerance, but you're an arsonist wearing a fireman's hat.
Okay.
Using the kind of rhetoric that you do.
I should say, just for the record, that Connor Friedersdorf did convince me, I think he made a very strong case, that labeling everybody who opposes marriage equality as a bigot or a homophobe isn't just ineffective, it's probably incorrect. So I do think that a better way to say it is that people who oppose gay rights, let's call it equal rights for gay people, are driven by some kind of anti-gay animus. Now, whether that anti-gay animus arises organically from whatever, traditional beliefs, from societal conditioning, I still think that the word animus, I'm sticking to my guns here, I think that the word animus really does capture what people who oppose gay rights feel. So the question, to my mind, is not whether people who say gay people do not deserve equal rights. The question is not whether they're driven by animus. The question is whether that animus is justified.
It's a deep failure of the Christian Church that someone like you feels the any attempt to kind of publicly defend the Christian position on this as an expression of animus and hatred. And that's something that grieves me as a Christian, that you don't feel our statement of this belief to be a counsel of love and hope.
Well, I mean, if you look at a lot of the anti-gay protests of the last couple decades, a lot of which were driven by churches, if you look at the pro-Prop 8 protests, for instance, a lot of them are filled with vitriol. I mean, a lot of them are filled with true rancor, and what, in that context, I would definitely label as prejudice against gay people, labeling gay people to be sick, labeling gay people to be defective, to be disgusting. A lot of those were driven by churches, and so, I mean, I think it's understandable, even if you hold it's not justifiable, I think it's understandable why so many gay people do feel that the church's position on gay rights has descended to a level of animus. I mean, would you disagree that a lot of those protests which were led by churches descended to a kind of prejudice level? Or do you think that they maintained a level of Christian courtesy, politeness?
Yeah, well, without looking at this specific protest, I would say, for someone with my kind of view of human nature, we're all fallen. The church is stocked not, with it's kind of notional saints, but practical sinners. And so I'm not, that surprised or scandalized when I see Christians falling short of Christianity. What I think I want to push you on here, Mark, though, is this idea. First of all, it seems to me that you're kind of saying there's either a sort of objective state of animus that has nothing to do with the effective disposition of the person charged with animus, in which case I wonder how helpful it is to use terms like homophobia or animus that, at least colloquially, we take to describe emotional states. And so that's one possibility that you're saying this is sort of just objective condition of animus, irrespective of how the person feels. Another is that you're saying is that there's a kind of false consciousness. You think you don't hate gay people, but in fact you do. And where I really want to press you on this point is the fact that it seems to me that you very unfortunately divide gay people from people of faith and suggest that the twain never meet. In fact, I have a great number of friends who are out gay Christians who nonetheless ascribe to the church's teaching that marriage is necessarily between a man and a woman. They abide by this, in their own lives as best they can, just as any Christian abides by such a counsel, any moral counsel. And in public, they also defend this position. And I'm just sort of curious how you make sense of such strange birds. I mean, do you recognize that they exist, what sort of are they self-loathing? I mean, what kind of descriptors from the kind of past ideological campaigns of denial do we need to revive to describe these people?
No, I don't think that they're self-loathing. I think that they're both Christians and they're gay, and I think that they've sort of analyzed the components of their beliefs and of their identity and privileged their devout Christianity and their subscription to very traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs over their personal beliefs and what rights they possibly should be afforded. I think there are very, very, very few gay people in the world who are like that. But as you said, those strange birds do exist. Fewer and fewer, but they're out there. And I would not label them all self-loathing. I think that would be absolutely absurd. Like I said, they've just decided to privilege their Orthodox Christian beliefs over their perhaps personal, insinuations to themselves about what they believe they deserve in the realm of legal equality. Now, I would ask
Sure.
you've spoken about Christianity that opposes fundamentally the notion of same-sex marriage. What about Christianity that fully endorses and supports it? I mean, we just saw a few weeks ago a North Carolina lawsuit against that state's gay marriage ban led by the United Church of Christ. So you clearly have a lot of Christian denominations, a lot of people of the Christian faith, a lot of very devout Christians who take their faith very seriously, who are strongly in support of gay rights. Do you sense that there's a clash within the whole Christian edifice right now? Do you sense that there's going to be some dissonance, or do you think that the fundamental belief in marriage as not permitting same-sex couples will hold strong?
So if you look, throughout Christian history, there are periods of controversy over discrete questions that consume the church and also usually draw the involvement of political leaders. So you might have Christian councils in the Mediterranean debating Christological questions like whether Christ is of two natures that seem to us very silly and abstract, but at the time were very pressing, to the point where you would have bishops who voted the wrong way at a council come back and be killed by their congregations. And then usually after about a 100-year period of controversy within the church, the matter settles down. And I think right now the Christian church is going through such a kind of period of agony and debate broadly over matters of sexuality. You see that beginning with the Lambeth Conference in the Episcopal Church, where for the first time a major Christian body approved contraception, with Humanae Vitae, with the kind of rise of gay marriage in the churches. And so, yeah, there certainly are Christians who support gay marriage, and the churches will continue to hash it out. And it's not surprising that this kind of spills out into the public square, because I see our public imagination as still totally captured by Christianity, whether positively or negatively. And I think your work is a testament to that.
So do you think that a true Christian can truly believe, or should I say, do you think that true Christianity can accommodate the notion of marriage as being between two people of the same sex? Or do you think that any version of Christianity that does accommodate that notion is false Christianity?
I'm sure there are Christians who are truer Christians than I who hold that view, but that's not the view the church has held or will hold, and it's foreign to kind of traditional historic Christianity.
So it's not true Christianity.
I mean, not just in the sense that the Bible says in a couple individual verses, don't do this, but the fact the kind of whole Christian vision of creation is bound up with the idea that the church is the bride of Christ, Christ is the church's groom. There's a lot kind of bound up in marriage in the Christian tradition broadly, and to kind of pull on that thread is to unravel this whole seamless garment. Okay,
I've heard people who bill themselves as being very devout Christians saying the exact opposite. That to continue to,
and I wouldn't deny their Christianity. I would just say
that they're wrong.
They may be a better Christian than I am. Right. I have no doubt that they're totally sincere. I just happen to disagree with them, and I think I'm right.
at some point we have to boil it down to I'm right and you're wrong, right? Okay, so that's fair enough. But here's my question now then. And I know we're supposed to be finding common ground soon, so we'll get there. But I just have to ask, if this is a lively debate within the church, as you've said, if this is definitely a discrete question that the church is internally debating, and that there are many true Christians who sincerely believe the opposite of what you believe, then why is it so pressing and why is it so necessary to prevent the state from recognizing same-sex couples in civil marriage? Or do you believe it is? I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your position is on this. Do you believe that it's important that the state, the government, this American secular government of each state, do you believe that these states should not recognize same-sex marriage? Or do you believe that they should? Or do you believe they can? What is your position on that?
So, as you're suggesting, it's certainly possible to believe that, as a religious matter, marriage is only between a man and a woman, and to accept the state civilly defining it as between any two people. That's certainly possible. Many people do. A theologian I very much admire, Paul Griffiths, argued for this position quite eloquently, though I think unconvincingly, in Common-Weal magazine a number of years ago. The reason that I reject that position, so I think that marriage is something that existed before the church, before the state, and something that the Christian church kind of acknowledges on its own terms and incorporates into Christianity without changing its basic elements. It was only after some time in Christian history that marriage was even treated as a religious matter. Marriages were just sort of contracted essentially between the two people, and then eventually the church might come along and sort of acknowledge the fait accompli. So the reason that I think it's important to continue to uphold the idea that marriage is only between the reality that marriage can only exist between a man and a woman civilly is that there's no other coherent account of marriage available, and not only no other coherent account, but no other account that accords with so well with human flourishing, with human well-being. So, Mark, I would say, when it comes to like a Christian, or I would say any person looking at what the definition of civil marriage ought to be, there's only one option. It's embedded in the very kind of idea of marriage that it be between a man and a woman, and this is you see this even or especially in the way the gay. The movement for gay marriage thinks and talks about, what it seeks to advance. So I'm not that comfortable. So, for example, I'm not that comfortable with the way a lot of opponents of gay marriage talk about the redefinition of marriage. In a sense, it is a redefinition because you're including the possibility of men marrying men or women. But at a more fundamental sense, the definition of marriage has remained, shockingly stable, even though this change has occurred. If I were to offer a kind of summary of the sort of general Catholic account of what marriage naturally is, it would be it's permanent, it's exclusive, it's open to life, and I think you see all of those. Or open to life means there's an idea that there are going to be generations, that it leads to bearing and rearing children, and you certainly see that in the way gay marriage is framed. Permanence. I think everyone who enters into a marriage, we accept no fault divorce. We realize things don't work out, but like on your wedding day, everyone, their ideal is that this is going to last. I mean, it's a reach for something enduring. In exclusivity, we may have monogamish, but the fact that concessions like that need to be, the fact that we're still ishing, trying to get as close as we can to monogamy shows that that idea of exclusivity is also a really attractive one. And then, especially in terms of openness to life, I think it's an idea that it would have and still does seem strange to many gay or queer people that two men would come together and try to adopt a child. But when you think of this union as marriage, there's nothing more natural than that idea. And so while it may seem odd to people who aren't kind of sympathetic to the idea of marriage itself, it shows how deeply the gay rights movement has kind of understood the logic of marriage and how close they want to get to this older ideal. And so, but then I would say this, and this is where I risk rudeness. I'd say that ideal doesn't make sense unless it's between a man and a woman. And I'm not sure that broadly society agrees, or I'm not sure that broadly people disagree with that norm, that the kind of ideal version of marriage is between a man and a woman, but they think, well, whatever the norms are, they aren't exceptionless. People don't mind having norms, but they always want exceptions around the edges because people want to be nice. Like, who doesn't want to say to your gay friend, absolutely, I support you in this. I love you, I'm there for you, how can I help you? I mean, everyone wants to be able to say that. So that's why people don't want to kind of defend the coherence of that norm.
So I find it interesting that you say there's no alternative that makes sense, because I'm sure you've read Robert P. George's What is Marriage? I've read it several times. A classic of the genre. And in that book, an article, he presents two different visions of marriage, right? He talks about conjugal marriage, which is the marriage that you just described, right? The classic traditional marriage between a man and a woman, geared toward procreation especially, right? And then he talks about revisionist marriage, and despite giving it that kind of unpleasant label, right, like revisionist, whoever wants to be a revisionist, he does describe it in a way that makes sense to him, and I think makes sense to me. And the question behind what is marriage is not, is revisionist marriage a valid conception of marriage per se? It's whether it's a conception of marriage that the state should recognize and that we should all be happy with and be okay with and accept. And of course, I mean, George describes revisionist marriage as essentially conjugal marriage minus the conjugal part, right? You're not able to procreate if you're in a revisionist marriage, which is essentially a same-sex marriage. That's the one factor that's been taken out of it. All the other components of, affection and lifelong devotion and child rearing and all of those things are still, conceivably very much alive and well. It's just that the ability to actually procreate has been taken out. So can I assume that your position is that once you've taken out that one component, the ability to actually physically procreate, that the entire rest of the edifice of marriage crumbles?
I think that you can find much more fitting ways to describe same-sex love than marriage. Yeah, absolutely.
But it should still be the role of the state to deny same-sex couples the ability to obtain a civil marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. It's just a matter of total incoherence to say that a union between a man and a man, however loving, however enduring, however admirable, in many discrete ways, is a marriage. One of my favorite writers, Don Colacho, a Colombian aphorist who lived in the last century, said that in these times, an intelligent man's project has to be the restoration of definitions. And I think if we can try to use words precisely, that will be a great aid to us.
Okay, I don't protest using words precisely. I just wonder whether we want our subjective definitions.
We disagree over
over to be
the
forced on the state. But no, that's, okay. I question how truly coherent that is. If we are using procreation as the linchpin of marriage, then of course you wind up in these exceptional categories that are actually fairly common. Infertile couples getting married, 60-year-olds getting married, and you have to wonder how much the state should wade in there in order to keep the definition of marriage purified, right?
That, I think that you're sort of trying to find little exceptions, and it's good to try to kind of frisk these ideas, but I would say that we don't make kind of rules based on borderline cases, and nor is it necessary as a matter of logic or law to do so. It's worth kind of pressing that case to see if people see those exceptions as sort of those little kind of exceptions around the edges as undermining the whole edifice of thinking about marriage. or not. And, so here's an example. I mean, this is not like a new. This isn't like a fast one. That you're pulling on the tradition. I think that it's actually it's been a matter of some internal reflection. So the idea that a marriage can be annulled if it hasn't been consummated, shows that, and so to look at it this way, a marriage can be annulled if it hasn't been consummated. A marriage cannot be annulled if the one person happens to be infertile, traditionally under canon law. And so the idea there is, it's about, is the plumbing there, not what's running through it. So to be able to consummate a marriage, you have to, say, not be, paralyzed from the waist down, or be a eunuch, or for that matter, you have to not be a woman who's trying to consummate with a woman. But infertility in no way inhibits consummation. And so there's always been, so that kind of objection you're raising there is one that is sort of already anticipated in the logic, the kind of common law logic of the way marriage cases have been adjudicated.
Sure. I just wonder if, I've brought it up before in debates, and it's always sort of written off as, oh, it's a borderline case, it's a little issue around the edges. But we're seeing more and more of these kinds of marriages, aren't we? Marriages where the couple doesn't anticipate having children, marriages where the couple simply can't have children, second marriages of people in their middle-aged, elderly people getting married, people who cannot or will not physically procreate. And so I wonder if it reaches a critical mass here, where you have a lot of straight people getting married with no intention or no ability to procreate, could this issue be re-examined by the church, do you think? I mean, do you think that the idea that all straight marriages are fundamentally conjugal is going to start to become kind of a joke?
Yeah, I think that people will continue to mock Christ under some pretext or other. As far as whether it will be this one, I don't know. I do know that it's that the church right now in its catechesis does insist to, and this is true, I think, not just in the Catholic Church, but in the Christian community more broadly. There's a really strong idea that marriage should be oriented toward children. Now, so you have some people like Catholics saying that means no contraception. A lot of people wouldn't go that far, but they would say you need to reject a contraceptive mentality, a contraceptive mindset. Right now, I don't know if you've followed this, Mark, there's an interesting debate going on within the Catholic Church over whether or not divorced and remarried Catholics can be admitted to communion. And now what that means is whether marriage really is permanent. If marriage is permanent, it doesn't really make sense to have someone who is no longer with their spouse but is instead living with another person who the church would have to insist is not their spouse. So the church isn't just mean to gay people, but the church is mean to lots of folks. If you
right.
want to describe, it's not a kind of one-off campaign against this one little group. I mean, Christianity can be kind of accused of all sorts of unkindness.
Right, although it's not trying to keep those divorced people from getting communion and trying to keep them from having their marriages recognized by the state. Whereas within the realm of gay marriage, it's specifically trying to, or at least as described by you, there is a vested interest in Christianity in preventing the state from recognizing gay marriages. So it's a little different between an internal debate about communion and an external debate about what civil marriages the government can recognize.
Yeah, I would like to see, the opportunity for Christians to spend much more time speaking against, the kind of culture of easy divorce. Now, the church wouldn't want to totally exclude, civil divorce, and the real objection, to be clear for Christians, is not so much in the idea that you're civilly separated from the spouse. It's in the idea that you would leave a spouse and then marry another person, because that second union would be viewed as violating the permanence and exclusivity of the first. So there are kind of a few different things here, but I will say this, Mark. Now, it's a kind of common suggestion that people who are opposing gay marriage are wildly inconsistent because they don't also oppose divorce. Now, if you look at the career of someone like Maggie Gallagher, who I think, whatever people have said, is an activist who's deeply admirable. She became a single mother. At Yale, she began speaking out against divorce early in her career. It was only later that she turned to the matter of gay marriage. You have other people, lots of academics who talked about the problems in divorce. Brad Wilcox had a wonderful article in the Policy Quarterly National Affairs arguing that there are kind of certain steps we can take to move back, to back away from this culture of divorce. And so that's something I really would want to see. I wouldn't want to just say, oh, that's a civil matter, the church has no concern there. I think, so I would say, since we're supposed to see common ground, let me just say that I do think there is a lot of inconsistency among Christians in the way that gay marriage and divorce are treated. But while admitting that, I would say that a lot of the people who have been most engaged in the campaign against gay marriage actually have also been very engaged in the campaign against divorce, and would be even more engaged in it if they weren't trying to address gay marriage.
But why this total disparity of passion here? I mean, the campaign against gay marriage has not been an exclusively internal one. Much of the campaign against gay marriage has been a campaign to prevent the state from recognizing gay marriages. Why is there not a widespread campaign to prevent the state from recognizing second marriages following divorces?
It's kind of, it's not quite apples and oranges. There's a rotten apple and a rotten orange, and one's on your plate and one isn't, and you have to kind of address things as they come along.
So do you think that at some point that might be a concern for the church, to try to prevent the state from recognizing marriages following divorces?
That's an interesting question. I don't see why that would be the case. If they're not Christian, I'm really not sure. It's just something that I haven't considered.
Fair.
If I could,
I'll try to learn more about that.
If I could shift the topic a little bit back towards some of the more recent legislation that's been considered in states like Arizona and Kansas. Broadly interpreted, some people were thinking that these laws could enable refusal of service to gay people for any reason, not just things related to same-sex marriages. Matthew, what did you think of that legislation? And do you think a hotel owner refusing a gay couple a room or something along those lines, do you think that should be legally protected?
It's hard to have a debate about these matters when people like Mark are always wildly misreporting them. So in one of your articles in Slate, Mark, I think it was about the Kansas bill, you linked with apparent seriousness to a case. I think it was in Kansas about someone being refused accommodation. It was written in like a Kansas alt weekly as a satirical article by a person who's only written satirical articles, and I don't think you realize that. And so it's a little bit hard to have a discussion when people like Mark are feeding to the kind of mainstream media lies and falsehoods.
I will say that was certainly my error, but I did replace it with an article that was a real article. I had my satire radar on at that point, and it was an article about a gay couple being rejected from a Walmart, and it was real and actually did happen, for the record. But I do apologize for my error.
Right. Thanks. Errors happen all the time, of course. But I would say, and so in terms of this Walmart case, I would say, of course, I'd oppose any law that did that. And if this law could be read as doing that, I'm sure that such a reading of it would be excluded on appeal, or that the prosecution would never go anywhere. So I have to say, I want to kind of keep following this trail though about the problems with the way that the kind of irresponsibility of the kind of gay rights journalism broadly, as represented by Mark. He wrote a blog post about the firing of Brendan Eich, or his resignation, saying that this revealed conservative hypocrisy because conservatives were saying it was a violation of his First Amendment rights two articles Mark linked to for that piece were written by Andrew Sullivan and Rod Dreher. Neither one invoked the First Amendment or said it was a violation of its constitutional rights, but that didn't matter. Conservatives were hypocrites. In fact, in Rod Dreher's article, the only mention of free speech in the original article came in the statement posted by Mozilla itself. So here we had a conservative journalist saying, why doesn't this corporation kind of uphold their own values, abstractly expressed, not concretized as constitutional imperatives? And then Mark misrepresents it. Again, with this recent bill in North Carolina. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, soon after in the article I note that this isn't really about the constitutional issue of free speech. This is more of the general principle of free speech, this notion of freedom of association, the freedom of association of Mozilla to put pressure perhaps on Brendan Eich to resign versus the freedom of association of Hobby Lobby to, refuse to provide contraceptive care. I meant it in a much broader context, and I did link to a number of articles throughout the piece that talk about it, not in a constitutional sense, but in a broader sense of the abstract principle of freedom of association as opposed to the letter of the law in the First Amendment.
Mark, were you troubled at all by how the Eich case played out? There were some kind of, it could be seen as a witch hunt for people who supported Prop 8, and Eich himself was far from a flaming bigot or anything like that. Was there anything in how this played out that disturbed you?
Here's the thing about the Eich case. I feel like it was a very kind of specific incident. Mozilla and my former colleague Farhad Manjoo wrote about this in the New York Times. Mozilla is, yes, it's a part of it is a for-profit company, but it has a very specific progressive mission. It is a progressive company. They have a very strong gay rights platform. They have a very strong gay rights employee policy, and so I feel like, and they were hiring Brendan Eich as their CEO, who is the functional mouthpiece of an organization, right? That's what Brendan Eich would have been. So I think if we consider all of those components together, right, Mozilla's stated missions, Brendan Eich's previous actions, Brendan Eich becoming the mouthpiece of Mozilla, then it seemed fair to me to criticize Mozilla for elevating him to that position. Now, it's important to remember Mozilla didn't fire him, right? And Mozilla even offered him another position after he voluntarily resigned. So it's not as though he was totally ousted from his job in the way that many, many, many gay people are simply for being gay still across America. No, he wasn't fired. So I think that for whatever precedential value the Brendan Eich situation needs to be limited to those narrow categories. I certainly do not want a witch hunt of everyone who donated to Proposition 8 or the other, dozens and dozens of anti-gay marriage amendments that occurred across the country. That would just be absurd, and it would hinder progress, because the idea is that we're forgiving people, we're allowing people to disown their previous views about gay marriage, and holding them to past action seems to me to be generally a terrible idea. But Brendan Eich never apologized, so it doesn't seem to me to be an outrageous thing to say, hey, you donated $1,000 to one of the most traumatic anti-gay campaigns in history. Perhaps Mozilla should reconsider you being its mouthpiece.
What was the trauma of Proposition 8?
Well, I wrote an article about this and just linked to a number of commercials. The entire campaign of Proposition 8... Did you
link to the commercial of that showed Mormon missionaries breaking into a gay person's house and going through their underwear drawer? This kind of ridiculously kind of like know-nothing-ish anti-Mormon ad. Did you link to that video?
But I linked to many videos that show people concerned, fretting, teachers, parents, worrying about how gay people are going to convert their children to being gay, that gay people are predators trying to seek out and convert children, that gay parents are inferior parents. I know a number of people who lived in California at the time who were
Did this cause trauma or excite outrage?
Well, I know one person who lived in California at the time who tried to kill himself during the Proposition 8 campaign, a gay person who was closeted at the time and was inundated by the commercials. I'm not going to blame that on the commercials, of course. You can't blame that on the commercials. It's free speech. But I will say
I'm also not
that,
going to question your friend's experience. I just want to say that,
right.
I respect that. I'm not denying that these things were harmful, but I think that it's maybe worth vetting, the use of words like, trauma and things like that.
I would stick with the notion of trauma because it seemed like gay people were being depicted as predators. It was very upsetting to see this on the airwaves constantly. I was in Florida at the time, and we had Question 2, and it was a similar campaign to depict gay people as out to get your children. If you're a young gay person at that time and you're still coming into your identity and you're still trying to find your way, and you see society, mainstream society, constantly depicting you as some sort of horrible creature, and it's very upsetting. It's very difficult. Now, I'm not saying that it should be censored, obviously. This is quintessential political speech. But I would say that it was a traumatic experience for young people who lived through it. It was their formative years of coming into their own identities, and they were being told that their identities were monstrous.
So going back to your statement about Eich, Mark, I think that what you've laid out a consistent position. You've said that companies, maybe not all, I'm not quite sure on this, have the right to discriminate. So I'm not sure what you would say about GM not hiring someone because they either opposed or supported gay marriage. But earlier you said Catholic schools can hire and fire teachers. Maybe that's an exception because they have an explicit religious identity. But I guess my question is, you said that you wouldn't want to have a kind of, I think you said witch hunt, broadly against these types. Andrew Sullivan
would be a nightmarishly terrible idea.
Right. Well, Andrew Sullivan called you the gay Politburo.
Hominterm commissar. Like homo, right. Hominterm, yeah.
I mean,
it's pretty good.
I would describe your journalism more as like the petty inquisitor. You're not the Grand Inquisitor. You don't have kind of like the fancy robes, or the subtle Thomistic theology, But you're trying to smoke out this this heresy, this bigotry, and so obviously for someone who's like you, who's chosen that line of work, there are questions of how far do you go, what's prudent, and in the Eich case, are you sort of saying it's okay to have the wrong views so long as you're not in an important position at an important organization, or say like if you want to be Amish, you can go off and be Amish, but if you want to run Mozilla, well then we're gonna frisk your faith and find it wanting.
First of all, petty inquisitor is a great label. I want to get T-shirts printed out like that.
I'm glad you don't mind it too much.
No, so here's what I would say on this issue. I agree with my colleague Jamel Bowie entirely that what we really need are laws preventing employment discrimination based on political views. I think that would be a wonderful thing for states to have, and I would hope that those laws would be written to encompass whatever subtle pressure was put on Eich, because he wasn't fired, but I'm sure there was pressure put on him within the company, and I would love to see states refuse that, because if we had a neutral principle there saying that someone who donated to Prop 8, someone who donated to the groups opposing Prop 8, anybody from a janitor up through to the CEO, that there cannot be any kind of discrimination based on their political views, and donations would of course be encompassed in that. I think that would be a fantastic neutral principle to govern all employment practices, and I would thoroughly support it. I would vote for it. I'd probably even give money to a proposition to do that. I don't think that as a general rule it's good to be going around doing this kind of witch hunt, going through and saying, oh, well, this guy donated Prop 8, so he's bad. Oh, well, this guy donated to the group opposing Prop 8, so he must be good. Let's hire him. These are terrible reasons to hire people, as a general rule. Maybe Mozilla is a little different. It has a very progressive philosophy. It's a special kind of company. But as a general rule, it's a stupid thing to hire people based on what campaigns they've donated to in the past. So I assume you believe the same thing if we're looking for common ground. And my colleague Will Salatan wrote a great piece about this. the witch hunt for all Prop 8 supporters. He noted how many people at Google supported Prop 8, gave money, how many people at AT&T, these tech giants we generally presume to be progressive. There were tons of Prop 8 supporters there. There were many. I do not believe that we should go searching out those people and, putting pressure on them to resign. I think it's a terrible idea. I think as a general rule, we should let political beliefs stand, and so long as they're not interfering with how someone's conducting their business in the office, then they really don't matter.
Yeah, I would bulk, supporting a law like the one you're suggesting. I mean, obviously the specifics are everything in a case like this, but
Sure.
to kind of have this, this sort of massive legal vehicle for kind of examining how corporations do their business, I'd be a little bit uneasy with. In the Eich case, I thought, it doesn't violate his, First Amendment rights, as you certainly pointed out. I think most people recognized for Mozilla to not want to hire him. What was so striking about that case, and I think eye-opening for a lot of people of faith, is that Brendan Eich is not a culture warrior.
Right.
I've written articles, just now in the debate I've said, I think marriage is between a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so if, the fact that I'm saying this in public, forums means that, if people want to come back and say to me, you said that, I say, fair game, absolutely, yes I did.
Right.
But with Eich, and I hope that I'm not too much of a flamethrower, Eich, certainly wasn't remotely one. He's sort of, by all accounts, super nice guy, really supportive, good to everybody, gay, straight, what have you. But that still wasn't enough. And I think that for a lot of people who are just kind of in business, try to keep their heads down, but they come from a Christian family, or they're kind of say they're immigrants, and especially in Silicon Valley. Are we going to have are we going to grade people on a curve? If they came from, say, from India or what have you, are they going to have to be up to speed on kind of the newest distillation of the American progressive philosophy? I think so. While there aren't constitutional questions involved here, I think again that for the officers of the Inquisition like yourself, you guys have a lot of very subtle questions you need to weigh.
Certainly. And these are questions that I believe that I weighed in discussing Brendan Eich's case. And they're questions that I've in discussing here, I think I examine with a good deal of nuance. And I agree with you, again, for the common ground here, I agree with you that it's a terrible idea to be grading people on a curve. And as a general rule, even if we don't want to make a law out of it, it is a terrible idea to be hiring or firing people based on their political views and based on their personal views. And, like you said, and like I noted, even if it's not a true First Amendment violation, to oust someone from an office because of their Christian beliefs, right? Because their Christian beliefs lead them to oppose same-sex marriage. It would still be a ridiculous.
I don't know for sure if Eich is a Christian, but yeah, but
okay, it would still be
given all that.
Right. So if their whatever beliefs lead them to oppose gay marriage, it would be a ridiculous intrusion on the personal realm of liberty if these people are not doing anything to insult their gay colleagues, if these people are not causing any, ruckus or disorder in the workplace, if these people are perfectly good workers and they hold these personal beliefs, it would be a startling encroachment on their liberty to allow a company to fire them. It would be a startling act of stupidity for a company to fire them. I think it would be terrible. If I were a boss, even as the petty inquisitor that I am, I would not fire someone simply because they didn't support gay marriage. So I'm entirely with you there. I don't think that that's where we're going as a culture. I think that the Brendan Eich
maybe we'll end up working at the same company, Mark.
That would be great. But look at the way you dress. You'd definitely be my boss. I mean, that's clear. You would show me up starting on day one. No, but look, I mean, I don't think that the Brendan Eich situation ultimately had that much to teach us. I think it was too discrete of a situation. I think it was too nuanced and too complex. If we start seeing a true witch hunt follow from that, I will be very alarmed. But the way things stand, I'm not certain that it's going to teach us that much or that it sets too much of a true precedent.
Well, what about Brandon Ambrosino, very gifted young writer? Like many young writers, says lots of things that are, false or kind of eyebrow raising or just not necessarily helpful from all angles. But then when he was offered a job by Vox, he weighed in very heavily against that. It was just a young man who's trying to kind of figure out his voice.
I think in retrospect, I might have been a little too mean to Ambro. I mean, sorry, I call him Ambro. Maybe that's not what his friends call him. I like to imagine they do. To Brandon, I was probably a little too mean. Here's the thing. I now agree with my colleague Brian Lauder's take on this, that a lot of his worst early articles that don't really make sense, whose theses don't really come together, whose headlines are sort of confusing and don't actually lead to a true conclusion, I think that those are really his editor's faults. I think that his editors should have sent him back and said, come back to me with a stronger draft, come back to me with a better conclusion here, because some of his early articles just don't tie together. His article about choosing to be gay, right, I've read a lot of good essays about this. And this one was just not one of them. This one just really didn't make sense, and that's what made it so easy to sort of tear apart. Now, I thought that he was getting hired at Vox, and we all sort of did the way that this was handled. We all assumed that he was getting hired to continue writing these kinds of articles, and that's what was so alarming. Like, Vox, which is, this great new company, I think it's been doing a great job. This great new magazine is hiring someone with very poor writing and explanatory skills to explain the gay rights movement. It seemed rather alarming. It turns out that that's not what he was hired to do. It turns out that he was hired to write about faith in America. And let me say here, I'm sure that Brandon Ambrosino is not watching this, because I'm sure that he must really loathe me, and deservedly so. He's done a really good job so far. And he really has. He's done a very good job talking about faith in America, talking about Christianity. He had a great piece about people misreporting how frequently they go to church. He's done a pretty good job. And so, as bad as his early pieces were, I think that now he's sort of acquitted himself, and he's done a fairly admirable job in his position at Vox. So I do regret being that mean to Brandon. The poor guy just had bad editors.
You're still there. Now the thing, I don't think that Brandon's pieces were that bad. I mean, he's just kind of a writer thinking his way through things from the edges, kind of trying out ideas that don't necessarily have to be immune to all criticisms. And so I think they're just sort of different styles of writing happening here. I mean, is this something that could, are these articles pieces that could just, withstand vetting by 1,000 hands, or that ought to be made the confessional documents of a new movement? Probably not. And that's actually a thing that, I hope that, this kind of new trend in Vox journalism doesn't take us too far too, where everything has to be the kind of authoritative explanation or the authoritative contextualization. I mean, sometimes it's nice to just come at things from the side in an incomplete manner.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little worrisome already, isn't it? Because Vox obviously has this kind of progressive slant, and so it's explaining things as though it's definitive truth, but it's explaining it in a progressive, slanted way. And I feel like I would like to believe that that's something that Slate avoids by presenting ourselves as sort of opinion journalism, argumentation journalism, where if I'm writing, some overly flame-throwing piece that's like way too vitriolic, well, at least it's still just my opinion. Whereas Vox journalism, with its Vox-splaining tendencies, it presents everything as the true and holy and final truth, and that's a little concerning to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right about that. The difference between the two publications, you see that between Slate Pitch and Vox Splain.
Yeah.
The difference between those, Slate Pitch is like the counterintuitive, like good is bad.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's the quintessential Slate Pitch. Good is bad. Yeah. That's what allows our website to exist.
Okay, well, I think we've come about to the end of our time. We did find some common ground, which I'll briefly reiterate, and you guys can add anything else you think you do agree on. Mark, you agreed, Catholic school can fire an openly gay teacher, and you were troubled by the possibility of witch hunts against employees who, for their political opinions, pro or con on same-sex marriage. Matthew, I think you conceded that Christians haven't been consistent on marriage always, especially when it relates to divorce. And
conceding that humans have been inconsistent is a very small concession.
And I think we both agree that Vox maybe is a little too authoritative. That was not quite in our subject area. Is there anything else that you think you two agree on?
Just quickly, hopefully without opening up too big a can of worms, I would say Mark wrote an article about a suit by the United Church of Christ in North Carolina against laws there that, according to the suit, make it so that a minister absolutely cannot perform a gay marriage. Now, in terms of common ground, I would say that if that's the case, I certainly agree with Mark that that's an unjust law. Now, I don't think that actually is the case, and there's been a debate about this. Ed Kilgore of the Washington Monthly, wrote this up, and then kind of came back and revised his post and said that there was a reasonably convincing argument that North Carolina's law was being read in a really strained manner. But I'll just say, if that reading's correct, I would agree with it.
And Mark, anything
Thank
else
you.
you would like to note as a point of agreement?
I'll just reiterate that when we're talking about the private sphere and we're talking about churches and private citizens conducting their own religious behavior, that's an area that the state should almost never encroach upon. And that I really do, in that realm, believe in strong free exercise rights and would never want the state to start butting its head in there.
Okay, well, I think we've had a great debate and conversation. It's covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Mark, and thanks to our viewers. And we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks so much.